In this episode of the Everyday Rose Show, we do some rose myth busting with my friend Michael Marriott. So let's get started. You know, I wasn't surprised when I sat down with Michael to actually do the video for this via Zoom. We ended up with over 2 hours of material. Not a shock. When Michael and I get going, we just get going, and we covered a lot. It's a lot to look at. We're going to do 2 parts, by the way. This is part 1 because we've got so much to get through. But I broke this part 1 and part 2, well, I will as well, into different sections. That way you can view a little bit, come back, view a little more, come back, view a little more. You'll see on the screen next to me a list of topics that we did. You'll also see marks for the minutes and the seconds when these topics actually begin. That's going to help you find them a little bit quicker. We covered an enormous amount of material, as you can see next to me right here. And we really just kind of, just want to give our opinion. There's over 60 years of experience between Michael and I. We just want to say, this is what we think. And this is what this video is basically all about. Also, each section has its own title card. So they look like this. So take a look for those as well. That's going to help you find each section a little bit quicker. So with that being covered, you can watch it in sections, take your time, enjoy it. But most of all, let's go meet Michael. Michael, it is so good to see you again. It's been, my gosh, I'm thinking summer of 2019 when I did my last UK tour, and we met up and had some visiting. And of course, since then we've had COVID. I know you had to cancel certain your overseas tours. You've got some local tours we'll talk about in a little bit. But so what have you been up to during this last year of COVID times?
Oh, I've been having a great time, actually. We just before, I don't know if you know, there's a thing called furlough over here. So it means it meant that you didn't have to work, but your salary was still paid, and the government paid your salary. So that was amazing. So actually,
how do we get in on that one?
It was a very good week. So we were very lucky. We live in a semi-detached house. So there's 2 halves to our house. We live in one half. The other half hadn't been lived in for over 35 years. And we were able to buy the other half just before lockdown started at the 1st of April last year. And so it meant that I've spent quite a lot of the last 12 months or so working on the house, basically ripping it all out and then putting it back together again inside. So I've been got a new trade now as a builder.
Yeah, whole new skills that you picked up as a builder, restorer, and stuff. I mean, it's got to be nice because it's going to give you guys some extra space. Also give you guys some privacy. Did it come with a garden?
Yeah, about a third of an acre garden, and
That's
of course
nice
that
size.
hadn't been touched either. So
Wow.
so that was a real jungle. I mean, we literally had to burrow down through the fallen trees, the brambles, the nettles, the ivy, to get to the bottom end of the garden, where we found an old brick building that we never even knew existed. So
That's. I mean, if it's hiding a brick building, that's pretty overgrown. I mean, that's like kudzu in the southeast where I live. It eats a house at that point.
Yeah. So that was great. And so we've done a very soft touch on it. We haven't sort of gone in with a bulldozer and cleared the whole lot. We've just sort of cleared it gently and left quite a lot of the fallen trees trees at an angle and quite a lot of the ivy. We obviously cleared the brambles and the nettles, and it sort of left these wonderful sort of pockets of garden that we can develop very sympathetically. So it's been great, actually. So the house we've basically all finished 2, 3, 4 months ago, and now it's sort of concentrating a bit more on the garden. And so yeah, it's been very good, actually. Perfect timing.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, with spring coming on now in your part of the world, certainly you're coming in the spring. I mean, you've now had close to a year to observe this garden and sort of see what's coming up and what's planted and what's arriving. And I hear a lot about it. I get questions a lot from people. I just inherited a garden, or I moved into a place that has an established garden. What do I do? And you've basically spent a year just with a primer on what to do when you inherit a jungle. And as you said, go slow. Don't rip out. Maybe do some editing, but don't rip it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, interestingly, we basically, the garden is, apart from some interesting fruit trees, which hopefully I'm going to get identified this summer, you can send leaves away for DNA analysis and they tell you what varieties they are. So these trees are probably over 100 years old, because the house, it was built late Victorian times, about 1890 or something like that. So apart from these fruit trees and some a couple of old lilac trees, I thought that's it. You know, basically there's nothing in that garden at all. But in fact, we found last year a couple of ramblers growing at the top of the garden, and tiny little flowers, some sort of multiflora hybrid, I guess, or something like that. And I sent it off to one or two experts, because I don't recognize it. I sent it off to the national expert in this country. He doesn't recognize it. So we've got a white one and a pink one. I mean, they have no great horticultural value. But,
no, but I think even if they don't have horticulture, they're survivors. You know, they're a testament of being overgrown. And all of a sudden, you know, you peel away layers like an onion, and all of a sudden there's this wonderful old rose that's been, you know, living forever. And it's a testament to nothing else, it's just how tough roses can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we cleared carefully around them, and now they're sprouting like mad. So hopefully this year and even better next year, we should get a really good crop of flowers. So it's great.
Well, that'll be fun. I mean, that's got to be fun to inherit. In 35 years too. I mean, you know, you and I are big proponents of soil health, and it's got to be wonderful to inherit an environment that basically no one's touched the soil, and it's just been allowed to do what nature does, and no one builds soil like nature. I mean, that's the best thing that we can do is mimic it.
Absolutely, yeah. And so the soil is good anyway, but as you say, you know, with it not being touched for 35 years, the soil is absolutely beautiful there. So the weeds are growing like mad, and a few plants that we planted as well are growing very well as well. So yeah.
Well, that sounds like a fun project. I mean, it's always, you know, I think it's always fun to have. You know, people always ask me, and I'm sure they ask you, you know, when do you think your garden will be done? And my answer is, I hope never. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't want my garden to be finished. How boring would that be? Then I'd have to go buy the house next door to have it work on.
Yeah, that's the great thing about gardening, is that you've never finished, and you can always tweak it a bit, and then there's always exciting new plants to buy and find a space for, and then plants go over, you know, get too old and they need digging out and replacing or whatever. So it's just such good fun.
I want to cover a little bit about your background before we kind of get into the myth busting. Obviously, you're known for, you know, your association with David Austin Roses for what, 35 years, if my memory serves, something along those lines.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but you had quite a bit going on before. You had a degree in botany, or agricultural botany, I understand. Yeah. And then, you know, armed with a diploma from Reading University or Reading University. I don't know how you pronounce it. Reading, tomato, we get the whole thing. You know, you went to Papua New Guinea, which of course is the next logical step. So, Michael, why Papua New Guinea?
Well, I actually took a year off in the middle of university and worked for a company called the Commonwealth Development Corporation. They sent me to Swaziland, which is in Southern Africa. And I had a great time down there because, you know, lots of, it's close to South Africa, and lots of national parks down there with, you know, wild animals, elephants and all the rest. And based on that, I reapplied after I'd finished university to the same company. And they offered me this job. First of all, I was out there for 5 years. And first of all, I went to Sabah, which is East Malaysia on the island of Borneo. And there they grew rubber, cocoa, and oil palm. And then I went to the Solomon Islands, which is out in the Pacific, sort of north of New Zealand, out in the middle of nowhere. That was just, you know, like paradise, really. And then last posting was to Papua New Guinea, and there was basically setting up a rubber plantation and surveying the land. So, you know, it was an amazing experience to go to that part of the world, which normally you'd, you know, cost an arm and a leg to fly out there. Yeah. So to go out to these Pacific islands and meet wonderful people out there as well, and of course the fauna and flora was just so different as well. So it a very exciting project. And the other thing, of course, is that because it's the other side of the world, every time you come home for leave, you could stop off on the way, so have a bit of a holiday, do some more exploring. So South America, India and Sri Lanka, and then the States as well. So it was a very good 5 years, wonderful, and I'm so glad I've done it.
I can imagine. I mean, it's like you said, it expanded your horticultural palette into plants that you would not have been familiar with or seen in certainly in England and the UK. And it also, I think, brings something that a lot of gardeners all have in common is we love to travel. And we do. We love to see new climates and new plants and discover new things. And of course, the flip side of that is that the plant that we want the most for our own garden is the one that we can't actually grow. Everybody up north wants fruit trees, and everybody down south wants citrus trees, and everybody down south wants lilac trees. And it doesn't.
Just in front of me, there's a tropical orchid looking a bit miserable. So on the windowsill,
Yeah, which is probably
I really
where it
don't
needs
want to
to
grow
be.
here.
And so then you came from there, and then you sort of began to dive into roses a little bit. But before we kind of get into that a little bit, I know there's a couple phases. There was this phase before you got to David Austin. I mean, were you into roses at all growing up? I mean, what was your background with them?
I've been passionate about plants and gardens ever since I was very little. My parents obviously were very keen gardeners, and we lived in France initially. And then when we moved back to the UK, we went to live with my grandparents. And they had a huge garden, about 2 acres or something. And because my parents were very busy, I actually took over most of the garden and did actually most of the gardening, and which was just wonderful. And part of the garden was a couple of these really miserable-looking rose beds with sort of classic sort of roses. We're talking about the 60s, I suppose, here.
That's kind of like when the rose bushes, the difference between rose bushes and trooping the colors was about the same thing at that point in time. There wasn't much gap between all lined up like soldiers in a row.
Absolutely. And to be fair to them, they weren't planted in a very good place. They were quite shady, and they've probably been there, been there for 30 or 40 years or something like that. So these things look really as miserable as anything. Hardly a leaf on them, the odd flower on top of a bare stick. And then a few odd ramblers or climbers growing up rusty old scaffolding poles. So, that was my experience of roses. So, not very inspiring, really.
No, not something to launch you into the illustrious rose career that you certainly had. So, did you have... was there a rose moment that you just went, okay, I know my grandparents' rose garden, but I didn't know this about roses? Was there a specific rose? What was that moment for you?
It was amazing, actually, because, we're watching television, and I can't remember if it was when I was back off leave or come home, but there was a program, actually, with David Austin in it, and with... being interviewed by Susan Cooper Willis, who is the founder of Port Merion Potteries. And she was a great fan of the David Austin English roses. And I didn't know anything about him or his roses at all. Hardly anybody did, actually. They're still fairly well unknown at that stage. And so they were sort of looking into his seedlings and various varieties introduced. There was one rose that he showed called Wise Portia. And it was just the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It was this sort of globular sort of flowers, lots and lots of petals, and this lovely shade of sort of lilac-y purple sort of colour. And I suddenly realised that actually roses can be beautiful at that stage.
Yeah, I had a similar moment. It was, I grew up in Miami, Florida, which is not exactly rose country. It's very tropical down there, needless to say. It doesn't mean you can't grow roses. It's just they were not on my radar growing up. And I was in California, in Los Angeles, which was the hotbed of the exhibition hybrid tea kind of movement. And I was watching a lecture by Steve Jones at the Los Angeles Rose Society on old garden roses, which I know we're going to talk about in just a little bit. And he showed a slide of a rose called Sombre-Ui, probably better known as Colonial White, I think is what more people feeling it's called now, regardless of whatever. This beautiful white bloom, massively packed with petals in this lovely circle and stuff. And then he showed some more old garden roses, and I went, okay, now I'm starting to feel like I'm seeing something that I can really love and work with, and it sounds like there were very similar moments. And then, so I mean, did you go straight into David Austin? I mean, was there a bridge between between coming back from overseas in Austin?
Yeah, I came back and just by chance got to work at a nursery that grew bedding plants and roses, all hybrid teas and floribundas, just north of London. That was a fairly not a very pleasant experience for one reason or another. Anyway, I stayed there about 11 months and then saw an advert for a job as nursery manager at David Austin's. And so I applied and went up there, got interviewed by him, and he took me on. And which was very brave of him, actually, because I mean, basically, I knew nothing about roses at all, or very little.
Yeah, well, he obviously saw something in you. I imagine he saw the passion. Is probably what he saw. And
yeah, and also he comes from a farming background, as I do. So you know, I'm very sort of practically minded. I love getting my hands dirty in the soil. So that sort of stuff was second nature to me. And of course, he wanted it. The job was nursery manager, and it was for the first, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, and I spent most of my time working out with everybody else out in the field, you know, doing whatever job was necessary, you know, whether it was weeding or heading back or whatever. And it was only gradually over the years that as the nursery developed, that my job changed. That was a great thing about working there. I mean, I worked there, as you said, for 35 years. Really, from one year to the next, it always sort of developed in various interesting ways. So that was wonderful.
Well, I think it's one of the wonderful things about agriculture and gardening in general. I mean, you know, it's you know, I mean, you look at your own career from, you know, overseas, doing what you're doing in very different climates, coming back, and then now David Austin, and like you said, started as a nursery manager. You've moved up through design and introduction, and becoming some ways a spokesperson for David Austin. And I mean, that's got to be one of the joys. And I'm sure for, you know, you got with David Austin, I think it was 1985, and those were the early days. I remember you telling the story that. Was it Graham Thomas that had just been introduced and kind of took him over the top?
Yeah, so it was 1983. I joined in 85. So in 1983, he introduced 3 fantastic varieties. There was Heritage, Mary Rose, and Graham Thomas was the one that really took the public by storm. And that was at the Chelsea Flower Show. And then everybody who went there wanted to see this fantastic new rose and find out about David Austin. And you can imagine the other rose growers getting very peeved about this. You know, who's this upstart?
Who's this young upstart here? Who does he think he is? This Mr. David Austin.
So yeah, I joined the nursery 2 years later, and it was great because then people started to take notice of him and his English roses. So you had more interesting people coming to visit the garden, and people like Graham Thomas came along, and various other growers and journalists and things like that came along from around the world, not just from the UK, from around the world. So that was part of my job, because David Austin was a bit of a shy person. He didn't particularly want to show these people around, you know. So it's my job to show these amazing people around the nursery, which I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed.
Yeah, I can imagine that'd be pretty heady too. I mean, all of a sudden, you know, you're working in a nursery in London, and then all of a sudden you apply for David Austin, and then, oh, by the way, here's Mr. Graham Stewart Thomas. Would you please show him around the garden? You're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, what an experience, though! Holy moly!
Oh yeah. Yeah, and then I gradually did more and more garden design, and then also traveling because we wanted to try and promote the roses around the world. One of my jobs was to travel various countries around the world, obviously a lot to the States and Canada, South Africa, around Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and even places like South Korea, and and then China as well. So, you know,
that's kind of, yeah. I like the fact that you used the words "my job was." I think there's a lot of people watching this right now going, "Well, that's a job I'd love to have."
I had to go and visit the Huntington Library, and I had to go and visit what's it, Longwood, in
Yeah. I know. I have to go to Japan and talk about David Austin roses. Oh my gosh, what a horrible day I'm having. Yeah, but to your credit, you did it well. I mean, you really were out there promoting the David Austin roses, and what always came through for me with you, and still does, was, and not just your passion, but your passion for the David Austin roses and your knowledge. I mean, I could name a variety, or you could see a variety without even know a sign and know exactly what it was and when it was introduced and the fragrance. And it wasn't because you were memorizing a catalog; it's because you really felt these roses in your soul. That's what I always felt.
Yeah, and on Instagram, I see occasional pictures of these really old Austin varieties. And there's one yesterday, I think, called Cymbeline, which appeared.
Yes.
And I hadn't seen that for Lord knows how long. And I can immediately smell it. I can picture it. Wow. I can smell it as well. It's got that very strong myrrh fragrance, and then things like Tamora, and what was the other one that had a honey fragrance? Oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it now. But yes, it's a good thing about Instagram. People are there's other passionate people about who grow these old varieties that the Austin nursery have long since dropped because partly because of the climate over here and just not very good varieties in UK type climate, but fantastic in places like California and Australia and New Zealand.
Well, and I think that's the normal cycle of roses. If you look through the history of roses, going back even to the Gallicas and take it through the hybrid perpetuals, the bourbons, the hybrid musk, the hybrid teas, floribundas, there was a ton of them introduced when that particular class may be at the forefront of something new, like David Austin certainly was in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, still is, quite honestly. But sooner or later, better ones come along, older ones are pushed out. It's the natural cycle of roses and plants to me. Now, you retired from David Austin, but you haven't thankfully retired from the world of roses. I imagine you're probably finding yourself as busy, if not busier. And people can reach you right now through your website is michaelmarriottrosarian.org. And that's on the screen right now, so people can take a look at it. You do consulting and you do design. I mean, all kinds of things that you've always done over the years. Just now you're doing it under your own name. But I know that we talked earlier about travel this year and doing garden tours. But you and Rosie, your wife Rosie, are doing something unique. Tell people what they are.
Well, you'll see it on the website. It's Todd Garden Tours. No, Todd starts with two old duffers. So
I'm not sure that's a correct expression, but I think people can figure out exactly what that means. But two old duffers, I love that one.
So it was Rosie's idea. We jumped it up at the beginning of the year, or she did rather, and because travel restrictions, with lockdown, nobody is able to travel around, and we thought, the good chances are that it'll be more or less cleared up by the summer. So we thought we'd start up this little tour company. They're just one-day tours, and so they're very COVID friendly. So everybody arrives in their own cars and goes between gardens in their own cars. And they're small groups, maximum 15. So it's very individualistic as well. And between myself and Rosie, we know a huge number of garden owners and head gardeners and things like that, and some really super gardens, some of them very, very rarely open to the public.
The tours sound great, and I know with both you and Rosie along, you may call it two old duffers, but I'll call it two old, very knowledgeable and inspiring duffers. That's the point behind it, is that we'll guide the people round and look at the garden through our eyes. So obviously I'm a rose expert and I know a lot about plants generally, and Rosie's passionate about design and colour, and also very, very knowledgeable about plants. And so, we'll hopefully be able to add quite a lot to walking around the garden with everybody. So it should be great fun. And again, your website, michaelmarriottrosarian.org, is the place to find. Even though you're almost sold out this year, I suspect sounds like you might be doing these again. And nice thing about 2022 is everything looks like it's going to be open for folks who want to come in from around the world. Roses are what pulls at our heartstrings, needless to say. And so let's start diving into a little bit about this. And I talked the show and I titled it, Rose Mythbusters. And, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you're supposed to maybe do, and do you really need to do them? And this isn't Michael and I saying, well, we're correct and you're wrong, by gosh. This is just us saying, well, okay, but let's think about this. Is this necessary? And so that's kind of what we're doing here. So don't look at this as like, oh my gosh, I'm doing things wrong. It's your garden. You do what you want to do. But we just want to kind of chat a little bit. And I think, Michael, where I'd like to start is maybe an unexpected place here a little bit, which is that, people talk about roses and they say, oh gosh, I love this rose. And, I want this rose because it repeats all the time. It's always in flower. I don't like this rose because it's out of flower for like, a day and a half and I don't want it anymore. And you and I have an affinity for what Peter Beals called the old beauties. And then David Austin was in love with these. And of course, Graham Stewart Thomas created Modest Font Abbey around these roses, which are the spring flowering old garden roses, the Gallicas, the Damask, the Albas, the Centifolias. I mean, just phenomenal roses that so let's start making these let's take some of these people who are maybe a little skeptical about these spring flowering old beautiful roses, and let's make the case. And I'm going to let you kind of roll off. So, for the defense of old garden roses, Michael Marriott, give us your best shot.
Well, they're characters, and one of the things that I really don't like about many modern plants, and I'm not just talking about roses, I'm talking about many plants, is that they end up as blobs of colour. And there's
here's pink, here's purple, here's white.
And my mind from that immediately goes to chrysanthemums, which are just sort of just blobs of colour. And there's no character there at all. Now, what the old roses have is masses and masses of very beautiful flowers and often very wonderful fragrance as well, but some just bucket loads of character as well. What you need to do, or actually what you don't need to not do, is prune them too much, because if you start pruning them too much, then you lose that character. So actually they're dead easy to look after. If you choose the right varieties, some of them are as tough as old boots. I mean, some are pretty rubbishy plants. Like
I've gone. I won't say the word hybrid perpetuals, but a few come to mind as things you might want to think twice about. But yeah, they are characters. I mean, and even within the classes. I mean, if you look at within the Albas, I mean, I have a bush of Madame Plantier, which I'm kind of in the process of rejuvenating, but it's in a spot where I can leave it go to its own. And when it's in full bloom, I mean, it's got to be 7 feet high and 10 feet wide. And it's not a blob. It's just this graceful display of these stunning, fragrant white blooms that you look at it and you go, oh my gosh, it just takes your breath away is what it does.
Yeah. And if you think that some of these old varieties like Officinalis and Albacea and things like that first came about around 1400. We don't really know when they came about. They've been around on this planet, at 600 years. And a lot of the time they won't have been looked after. And there's just hugely tough thing, very great survivors. And a lot of them very different. So, people think about old roses. You talk about sombrero earlier on being full of petals, and people have this mental image of an old rose being very full petal. But in fact, a lot of them aren't. A lot of them, some of them are full petal, but a very rounded shape. Some are more semi-double, and some are single. And then some are short. Only grows 3 foot tall. Some are great big monsters. Growing 6, 8, 10 feet tall.
Yeah, and I would also say, you hear the word, a lot of times the word that you hear for them is once flowering, which I hate that description, once flowering, because it sounds like, it's going to go for like a day or two and then it's gone, which is silly. I mean, they're spring flowering. And for me, here in the upstate of South Carolina, Zone 7, my Gallicas and my Albas and those roses, they'll bloom from, I'll get 4 to 5 weeks of good bloom out of them, which is a long time.
Well, I mean, if you compare them to things like peonies, and I mean, we've just had Comestias flowering in our garden here, and a week or 10 days. Peonies, 2 weeks maximum. Tulips, maybe a week or 10 days or something like that. And so actually, if I mean, a lot of the old roses here in the UK, I mean, they'll be flowering quite easily for 5 or 6 weeks.
Yeah,
So
which
even
is a
if it's
long time. I live in the
yeah,
Southeast, which, as you know, is azalea country. And they're gorgeous, but I mean, 3 weeks for an azalea, maybe,
yeah, yeah,
4 if you're lucky.
yeah.
And so, and that becomes a layer of gardening. I mean, use the old roses, even though they're spring flowering, but as you mentioned, the shrub, the plant itself is beautiful. Okay, maybe that's a backdrop for, later flowering perennials or later flowering roses. So incorporate them into the garden that way.
The other thing I think from your point of view is not so much of an issue over here because our summers are much cooler, but if it was with your hotter summers, then
Yes.
the flowers tend to get crisped up, I reckon.
Yeah, they will. I mean, for me, they'll start flowering, end of April, and they'll go all the way through well into the end of May. And then, July for me is hot. And even the repeat flowering roses almost shut down and go dormant a little bit. So, I mean, the old roses are beautiful, the spring flowering roses. And then you also get into the old roses, too, that are some of them are repeat flowering. I know a class that you adore and a class that I adore because they do extremely well for me, the old-fashioned tea roses, not the hybrid teas, but the old-fashioned tea roses from the mid to late 1800s. I mean, I know you have a great passion for them.
Yeah, and especially because, of course, I can't grow them here.
Citrus tree.
The summers just aren't hot enough, and you see some of the Mottisfont Abbey down the south of England, and they're miserable.
Yeah, but for the southeast where I live in Zone 7, and even if you get into Zone 8, Zone 9, I mean, even among modern roses, I'm hard pressed to find a better class of roses than the old-fashioned teas. I mean, they are nonstop flowering machines in my part. Even in July, they just go heat, humidity, shrug it off and move on.
And they have a very different look about them as well. There's different colors in there and do good fragrances. And then the other group that which I can grow here well actually is the Portlands.
Yes.
So things like Jacques Cartier, Rose de Reche, Comte de Chambord, things like that.
Indigo, Amanda Patenaude. I mean, there's so many beautiful ones.
Oh yeah, and they're very, very old rose in appearance, but repeat flower, and a lot of them have just the most fantastic fragrance.
And I think the nice thing too, when you just mentioned it just now, they have the old-fashioned rose look in terms of the spring flowering roses, but they repeat. They may not be in bloom constantly. That's a constant bloom, but you get a good repeat bloom out of them. And I find many of them too. They're rather tidy in their growth habit. They're not big sprawling monsters. At least not for me. I don't know how about for you.
Yes, they I think things like Jacques Cartier is a bit upright, so you need to grow it in the mixed border with other plants to sort of disguise its sort of rather upright legs. It's they're a beautiful group. I love those.
You get into much warmer climates. I grew up in Los Angeles, and they did extremely well there. As well. So they seem to have some good diversity. But Yolanda de Aragon, which can be, I probably butchered the name, who knows, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Beautiful fragrance on that one. I mean, beautiful rose. Yeah, the Portlands and the old teas. So, my encouragement would be too, to tell people, go explore these old roses, spring flowering, or even some of the other ones, and use them in your garden, because a spring flowering rose, when it's in full bloom, I find very few modern roses that can compete with a spring flowering rose in full bloom.
Good thing I find about looking harder to find more interesting varieties rather than going down to your local garden centre or whatever and just buying, picking up what's there, is you go to some of the specialist nurseries. And you can probably name them better than I can, but you go along to specialist nurseries. So in the UK, we have obviously David Austin Roses and Peter Beals have got a wonderful collection. And I always, so whatever plant it is, I always think it's so interesting to go along to the specialist grower of that plant, because you can see these exciting, wonderful new varieties you never normally see in garden centres, and then maybe you get a chance to talk to the owner who's absolutely passionate about that group of plants, and will talk to you for quite a long time, and just let you into little, not quite secrets, but just sort of little hints about how to grow them even better, or really special varieties. So.
Those little growers too. I mean, America, it's mail order. We're such a huge country that it's difficult. I happen to live near one called Roses Unlimited, and I've been buying from them for quite a while. Pat and Bill, they're an hour from me, so I can take a ride down there and take a look. But mail order is a good way to go. And the owners tend to be very good in terms of answering emails. You can get online with groups and talk about them as well. But the other case that I would make for these specialty growers like that, these are the folks who are keeping these roses in commerce.
Absolutely.
You know, it's not your big box stores. It's not your big garden centers. And I'm not knocking big garden centers and big box stores. Everyone has a place. Yeah. But if you love the diversity that is the rose, which is an amazingly diverse plant, it's these little growers, these mom and pop operations that they do it from the heart, not from the head. And those are the ones that are keeping these roses around. And that to me is why it's so important that we make sure we support them.
Yes, just so important. It just opens up a whole new what? I don't know, a whole new
group of offerings. You know, I mean, in America, I'll give you an example in America. So, you know, I remember looking once years ago when I had my nursery and going through, you know, various books to see, okay, how many roses were in commerce in America? How many different varieties? There was like 6,000 to 7,000 different varieties of roses that you could purchase in the United States. But if you went into a garden center or a box store, you would have thought, oh, maybe there's 60, maybe 50, 60 varieties of roses. Well, there's like 5,500 you've now just left out. And the old roses, you mentioned fragrance on the old roses. And one of the things that I want to discuss a little bit here as well is that people say, oh, I love the old roses because they smell. Nothing smells like an old rose. A modern rose doesn't smell like an old rose. And I'm thinking, boy, you haven't really investigated some. There's some modern roses that are just, I mean, they're you know, the coin of phrase, stink bombs. I mean,
yeah, and of course, I mean, the other fascinating thing about fragrance in roses, I mean, apart from the tropical epiphytic orchids, there's no other plant that has such a wide range of completely different fragrance types as the rose.
Yeah, so, well, and you've studied rose scent, so you would have some broad knowledge of that, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I was very, very lucky because when I worked at David Austin's, we got in this nose. You know, his job before he retired was to work for a company called Yardley's that made
perfumes and toiletries and things like that. Yeah.
So he was able to identify smells absolutely superbly. So he came along to the nursery maybe 2, 3, 4 times a year. I had this awful job where I had to walk around the whole day smelling roses with him. I mean, just such a dreadful job. I mean, can you imagine anything worse? I mean,
I know it'd be worse. I mean, that's I'd travel to Japan to promote David Austin roses, walk around the nursery smelling roses with a nose. Boy, that's I'm not sure it's worth getting out of bed for at that point.
So we had I enjoyed that so much, and he introduced me to a whole new world of smelling, of not just roses actually, but of a whole range of plants, and it adds a whole new level to appreciating plants. And,
it does. I mean, my introduction to that was when I first met Arnaud Delbar from the Delbar Roses in France, and I worked with them for a while in the United States. And I was over there when I met with Arnaud, and we were walking through the garden and walking through the fields, and he took a flower up, and he had a very good nose. I mean, they had a professional nose as well. And he really began to teach me how to, okay, here's the first scent. What's the scent that's coming behind it? And it's akin to tasting wine. What's at the front of the tongue? What's at the back of the tongue?
Yeah. Actually, I remember when I visited you, you had a very nice wine cellar. I don't know if you still have that.
There's still some left. And some will have your name on it, that's for sure.
So
we could probably uncork a few.
So in the rose world, there's 5 basic fragrances. There's the classic old rose fragrance. There's the tea fragrance, which you obviously find in the tea roses, and that smells like a freshly opened packet of China tea leaves. Then there's the myrrh fragrance, which is rather like aniseed. And then there's the huge range of different fruity fragrances, everything from apples and pears and all different citruses, bananas, mangoes, just about every single fruit you can imagine, including some tropical fruits like mangoes and guavas and lychees. And then there's the musk fragrance as well. And so the old rose, the tea, the musk, and the myrrh, they all come from the petals of the flowers, whereas the musky fragrance comes from the stamens of the flower. That it wafts on the air very easily, so you can smell it from quite a distance away. Whereas the other ones, you have to sort of more or less stick your nose into it to smell it. So yeah, the musky fragrance is mostly found in the ramblers. You know, the tiny little flowers, often single, semi-double flowers, thousands and thousands of flowers. I mean, they only flower once. but
those darn once flowering pesky ramblers.
But when they do flower, you know, you can hardly see a leaf on them. They're absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and when you guys are so good in England with the ramblers and growing them in the trees, I see it in America every now and then. It's not very often. I wish I would see it more often. I've got several that I recently planted, which are going to go up in the trees, and it's such a stunning sight when they're in bloom, and then when they're not in bloom, the canopy of the tree sort of absorbs them at that point. It's this wonderful combination that you get by growing them up into the trees, and like you said, the fragrance, you can smell it before you even get close to it.
Absolutely, yeah. And then some, of course, set a wonderful crop of hips. So something like Francis E. Lester. And Rambling Rector, you get thousands and thousands of flowers, and then equal number of hips, and they'll often last right through the winter if you get the right varieties. So
and the hips are important. Not only just they're beautiful to look at, but a lot of birds and wildlife, use those hips quite a bit, and that's so there's a whole you got the flowers and you got the hips for the wildlife in the wintertime, and it's a great and they're beautiful. I mean, they're well worth growing, and I always tell people too, with ramblers, because they bloom in the spring, well then you can also take like an autumn blooming clematis and grow it up into the rambler. And there's a great combination, because the clematis needs a structure to climb on anyway, and clematis like their feet in the shade, so its feet can be in the shade of the rambler, and then it can use the rambler as a structure to climb on without overwhelming. Basically have two ways to buy roses here, and I don't mean by mail order, and I don't mean by locally. You have what's called own root and what's called grafted. So I'm going to just explain the difference a little bit here, Michael, before we jump into this a little bit. So a grafted rose is where you basically take a piece of the rose and you graft it onto a piece of understock. The understock is vigorous by nature, and it's designed to sort of push that rose and push the vigor of that rose, maybe if it's not a particularly vigorous variety. In America, it's generally Dr. Yui. People see it as a small little semi-double red flower that will sometimes come up. That's called a sucker. The sucker is not the person who purchased the rose. It's what comes up from beneath the ground. That's what we're talking about here. Then you have what's called own root, which is really starting to take off in the United States. And that is where you take a cutting, you stick it in a rooting medium with some rooting hormone, you root it. So the roots of the rose are the same below the ground as they are above the ground, as opposed to a grafted variety where the rootstock is different from the one above. And that's a bit of a long explanation, but I want to talk about that. So I don't know how prevalent it is in the UK or around the rest of the world, but I mean, do you have any thoughts of own root versus grafted, or any thoughts on that?
I don't know of anybody in this country, I don't think, that does own root. It's partly because it takes a long time to because we've got a cooler climate, it takes a long time for them to become saleable plants. I mean, that's one of the reasons why they graft roses in Europe, in the UK especially, is it's a quick way of creating a saleable plant. I mean, in theory, own root is great because then there's no chance of the suckers coming up. Having said that, in the UK, we use an understock called Rosa laxa, which is like a dog rose, and it actually suckers very rarely. So it's not much of a problem, really. And I know we're going to touch this a bit later on, is if we plant deeply, then with the base of the stems below ground, then there's a chance for the plant to become effectively own root by just planting it deeply.
They will. They'll revert. We call it revert to their own roots over time, is what we basically the expression that we use. And it's, I mean, I like them for a couple of reasons. I've talked about this before in other programs that I've done. And I like the fact that you get a broader base out of an own root rose. You tend to get more canes to work with, and that makes a fuller plant. I have a Cardinal de Richelieu that's on its own roots, and Gallicas are known for spreading quite well, and it's probably got 20, 25 canes coming from underneath the ground, and it's this nice, big, broad base plant that you have. And as you mentioned, the understock's the same. If you live in a cold climate, dives back to the ground, comes back true to what it was. There's no problems with that as well. And the other thing, that For me, own roots is an own root rose is in its DNA is vigorous by nature, and that to me is the definition of a garden rose. And to me, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with grafted roses. If you grow cut flowers, if you exhibit, you might need that understock in order to get what you're looking for, which is a different end game than a garden rose, you know. But a vigorous rose is a garden rose, and a vigorous rose that can grow on its own roots, to me, makes the quintessential garden rose.
Yeah, I think one of the slight limitations with own root is that some varieties really don't like, and I think it's mostly the modern varieties really don't like growing, and they actually refuse to grow from cuttings or grow very poorly from.
No, they'll just sit. But I'll tell you, some of the old spinacissimas, for example, when I had my nursery, I tried to root some of them. Some of them were very, very difficult to root, even though they sucker like mad. So
strange, isn't it? Yeah,
there's no reason. Yeah, but you are correct. I mean, there are some varieties of roses that they just will not perform well on roots. They have to be grafted. Again, nothing wrong with that. Doesn't mean we should lose the rose.
For the ground covers, that they can grow them on their own roots over in this country. They grow them, they stick them straight into pots, and you can get a stable plant pretty quickly.
We're getting that more too in this country. Actually, they're almost bypassing the entire field-grown part of the process now.
Right.
We have more and more roses sold in America in pots as opposed to bare root. We'll talk about a little more detail on that when we get into planting. But that's becoming the saleable method now, is in a pot. And they'll actually take, and Greenheart Farms, Bill DeVore was the one who pioneered. It's a tray about yay big, and there's 72 cells or 58 cells, depending on the size of the tray. And they take that plug, for lack of a better word, and they will put it right in the final pot that they're going to sell it in, maybe a 2-quart, something like that, or 2 gallons sometimes, and literally grow it right in the pot, and it never actually even sees the ground.
Yeah, I mean, the slight downside I have about that is that actually, from the environmental point of view, bare root roses are so much more environmentally friendly than potted roses, because you don't have the pot, so you don't have the plastic, and you don't have the compost, and then you don't have the shipping costs either. So if you're talking about from an environmental point of view, then bare root roses. So there's grafted and there's own root, and then there's bare root and containerized. So you can have both in each of them.
A bare root rose can be own root. It can also be grafted. A container rose can be own root, and a container rose can also be grafted. So they're interchangeable in that sense of the word.
Yeah. But from an environmental point of view, if you want to be environmentally friendly, then bare root roses, whether it's own root or grafted, wins hands down. So,
well, I live in America, the land of vast wastage. So we were containers everywhere. So.
Yeah, which is awful, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I will say too, I mean, a lot of the roses I get in container. I mean, that's how I can get some of the old roses that I want. I can't get a bare root in America. I mean, if I want to go get some of the old garden roses, and even some of the roses that are out of commerce now, I can't get them, so I have no choice. But the one thing I will say about a bare root rose that I do kind of like, I like putting all of the root system in native soil.
Yeah. And also, you're planting them at a time when there's no great stress. So if you get a containerized rose and it's full of leaves or even got flowers on it, you try and plant that in the middle of summer. That plant is going to be a bit. What are you doing to me?
Yeah, and the chances are good too. It just came out of a cold frame or a greenhouse, and it's like there's this. You take it from that environment and put it right in the ground, like you said, in the summertime. That's a lot of shock for a plant. You kind of need to plan a transition period for that rose, basically, at that point in time. So I agree.
If you plant a bare root rose, it's got no leaves on it, no shoots at all. You plant it just at the start of the growing season. It's just going to gradually root out and leaf out, and it'll be there'll be no stress involved at all. So
I mean, your biggest challenge with a bare root rose is make sure you're planting it right side up. That's the. And I know you've gotten that email. I know you've got with a photograph of which part sticks out of the ground. And you're like, okay. We've all got that email, Michael. I know we have. But it's a good question. I certainly understand why people get confused with the two. And the other thing I'd like to talk about here, and just this to kind of wrap up this sort of section that we're talking about here, is that, and I get this and I know you get this too. people, you talked about the old rose. You talk about some of them have the full petals and some of them have the single petals, like, Gallica officinalis, for example, the apothecary rose. And I get people that look at that and they go, yeah, but that doesn't look like a rose. I just want to just go, it is a rose. It's been around for thousands. What do you mean it doesn't look like a rose? And I get where they're coming from, because they've all been preconditioned to think it has to be that hybrid tea with the high pointed center and the nice little swirl in the middle, and that's quote unquote what a rose quote unquote looks like. And I know it makes you crazy too. I mean, so
that's the original wild roses, of course, and you had 5 petals. And so that's what the original rose looks like.
Yeah, that's what a rose looks like.
And then I was reading today about, I was looking up Mrs. Oakley Fisher, which I expect you know.
Yes, beautiful yellow hybrid tea. Yeah.
Which is, it's a hybrid tea, and it's got 5 petals.
Yes.
In the 1920s, there was a whole group of them which were introduced, so things like Dainty Maid and Dainty Bess and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, all those ones. Yeah, Dainty Bess is still a classic in this anywhere in the world. Yeah.
And people love them in those times. So yes, it's that unfortunately, it's the I think without pointing the finger too much, it's the rose shows that are the reason why people think that a rose should look like a hybrid tea, because to win Queen of the Show or whatever it is, we don't have it very much over in this country. It has to be that perfect high pointed center with a little scroll in the middle, and that's what rose breeders were aiming to produce all the time. And so it became such a consistent product. The people, the rest of the plant really didn't matter as long as it produced this beautiful flower. I mean, it can be very beautiful flower at the end of a stem, which had to be sort of fairly stiff and straight.
Yeah, and upright, and standing up straight.
And of course, in this sort of second half of the 20th century, you could spray anything you wanted to really onto the roses. All sorts of
you could walk into a hardware American and buy DDT. I mean, it was just unbelievable what you could get. I mean, no, I agree. Yeah, I think the rose shows did it, and it sort of, and again, not blaming rose shows, but I'm going to blame rose shows. They sold that as the perfect rose. And the other thing that I find with, you talked about the old roses being great characters, and we talked about all the individuality. And I'm not saying all hybrid teas, because there are some that I truly love that are truly beautiful, but I feel at least in American breeding, we got into a while where it was like, okay, here's the white one, here's the red one, here's the yellow one, here's the orange one, and let's start again. Here's the white one, here's the red one, here's the yellow one, and let's start again. And you could put 5 red hybrid teas in a row, and good luck telling the difference.
No, absolutely. And they didn't stay on the market for very long either. No. They would stay on the market for 3, 4, 5 years, and then they ditch it and then get another variety. And it was all about marketing, really.
It really was. And and you had no, you talked about, David, you went back to Tamora and Cymbeline, long ago, that you had seen on Instagram, and I remember that rose, and I still get that every now and then. I'll go through an Instagram or something, and someone will bring up a rose, and I'll go, gosh, I used to grow that. I got to go find that rosy. Stanwell Perpetual.
Oh, yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. I came across it, and I went, why isn't that in my garden anymore? And so I found one, and I bought one, and it's coming. But I say I don't go back and go look at a red hybrid tea. Why didn't I grow that in my garden? I don't. I could pick anyone. To me, they look the same, and we've now just lost the hybrid tea fans.
But actually, interestingly, before we lose them,
but wait, hold on, Michael's going to save you.
Looking at some of the modern hybrids, I mean, the problem with the hybrid tea, it's a fleeting bit of beauty, because it's the bud stage. And so once it's opened up, because they don't have many petals, only maybe 20 or 30 petals, once they've opened up, they're sort of not very interesting, really. But actually, modern hybrids, and I think both, especially Cordes in Germany and some of the American breeders as well, it's beautiful at the bud stage, but actually because they've got often 50, 60, or even 100 petals, once they've opened up, then they look like old roses. So then you've got it's a great marriage of the beautiful hybrid tea bud and, when it's fully open, the very full petal flower of the old roses. So actually, and that's how the very original hybrid teas looked. You know, the very early hybrid teas.
They were very. If you go back to La France, which is one of the early hybrid teas, I mean, it had that kind of feel to it. It wasn't It was really, I mean, Peace was the one that is credited with the Peace Rose is credited with bringing in the modern hybrid tea, but it was quite fully petaled too in its own right. And Mayond, as a matter of fact, the House of Mayond that introduced the Peace Rose has some newer roses that are just, like you said, they have that hybrid tea bud and they open up and they're just this stunning rose on the inside as well.
So have fantastic fragrance as well. And not so stiff upright growth. So again, the very early hybrid teas had attractive shrubby growth, which was lost over the decades. But now it's come full circle. So I mean that's brilliant. It's very good for the rose industry, really. I think people, and of course, health and roses now just just no comparison. I mean they're super healthy. Yeah. A lot of them. That's become a primary, huge focus is chemicals are coming off the market. You have a whole generation of younger growers that don't want to deal with them anyway, even if they're on the market, they don't want to use them anymore, and they shouldn't. In my opinion, you and I have preached, sustainable rose growing for over 2 decades. I know, it's one of the things that you and I have in common. And I totally agree. And I think too, with the hybrid teas that were with the high centers and the long stems, you also have to realize what they were bred for. A lot of them were bred for the cut flower industry, Mother's Day and things on the Valentine's Day. And so for that, they do very well. They're very beautiful for that because they also travel extremely well, when they're grown in South America or Kenya or something like that. And also for rose exhibitors, they were grown for that specific purpose. But, I think, like you said, the newer ones that you're seeing that have the combination of the charm of that hybrid tea bud, which is beautiful and in that nice, beautiful stage. Yeah. And when they open up and they have that, then all of a sudden they have that fully petaled, fragrant charm to them. Yeah. It's a little like having your cake and eating it too, really, at that point, isn't it? Yeah, they're absolutely beautiful. So I think, I think what we can kind of take away from this segment is try the old roses. Those are really good. We're not dissing hybrid teas. We like the new ones. So, I think that's what it is. So, I think if we have to wrap this up, Michael, I mean, I think we've shown a diversity of roses, and I'm going to give you the last word. Just talk about the diversity of this phenomenal plant that you and I both love. Yeah, I don't think there's any other plant that is quite so diverse, actually. I mean, you can get everything from tiny little flowers, which are sort of, quarter or half an inch across, to great big things like Paul Leron, which are 8-10 inches across or something like that, and anything in between. You've got the Rosa sericea group, one of the wild roses only has 4 petals, whereas the wild roses have 5. And then you've got things like Spirit of Freedom from David Austin's, which has 200 petals, and then every habit of growth from things that go absolutely flat on the ground. To others that go, a bit like Compassion, which is has stems like steel rods that go straight up in the air, and others that grow up into trees. And then you've got all the varied fragrances as well. So I mentioned all the different basic fragrances, and it's not just the flowers, of course, that smell beautiful. Then you've got some that have attractively smelling leaves, like the sweetbriar that smells of green apples. And then you've got the moss roses. If you rub the sort of the mossy growth on it, it smells beautifully like resin. And then then you get into all the different ways you can use it in the garden. And I always say that there's practically the only place you can't grow rose is in the pond. There's the swamp rose, which is native to the States, Rosa palustris, which grows in the swamp. And I was reading today actually about, is it Rosa californica, that apparently grows a lot in wetlands, which I never realized before. And there's a rose called Rosa clinophylla, which grows in the floodwaters of the Brahmaputra River in India. So it spends 6 months of the year completely submerged by the flooding waters of the river. But yes, in more normal garden situations, there's everything from the little intimate formal areas to the wild, expansive areas, where you can just grow wild roses or to grow up into trees. So, and then on top of that, of course, there's the fact that it's such an important part of our culture. You know, there's no other plant that has such an impact, has had such an impact in our lives over thousands of years. You know, from the ancient Greeks and Romans to the present day. Still, you just got to look at, as you say, the red rose and Valentine's Day, and you see that goes on today. So, yeah, roses are just amazing.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. We covered a lot of material, and certainly in part 2, we're going to be covering a whole lot more, and look for that to come out fairly soon. You know, if you like the video, please, you know, share it with your friends, share it to your group, share it to your Rose Society, your Plant Society. I create these to get out there, so share with everybody you want. Please subscribe to my channel, give word of mouth out, and you know what? Until we meet again, happy rosing.